The music had barely faded when the room began to feel smaller, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Guests were still laughing, glasses still clinking, and white flowers still perfumed the air. She stood near the window in her wedding dress, fingers nervously twisting the thin band on her hand, trying to memorize the way happiness was supposed to feel. Then he spoke her name, quietly, with a tone she didn't recognize. They stepped aside, away from the crowd, into a corridor that smelled faintly of polish and old wood. He didn't look angry. That almost made it worse. His face was calm, distant, like someone delivering bad weather news. He told her this marriage had been a mistake. He said he had felt pressure, expectations, a sense of duty that had nothing to do with love. He said he wanted a divorce. At first, the words didn't land. They hovered between them, unreal. She waited for a punchline, a confession that this was some cruel joke. But his eyes stayed steady. He explained that the papers could be filed quickly, quietly, before gossip had time to grow teeth. He spoke as if discussing a cancelled trip. Her chest tightened. Just hours earlier, she had walked toward him believing she was stepping into a shared future. Now she was being asked to step back, carefully, so the damage would be minimal. She nodded because her body had forgotten how to do anything else. When he left to rejoin the guests, she stayed behind, staring at the wall until the pattern blurred. She didn't remember how she got out of the venue. At some point, she was sitting on the steps outside, dress pulled around her like spilled milk, night air cool against her overheated skin. Cars passed. Somewhere, someone laughed. The world kept moving with impressive indifference. A voice broke through the fog. A man stood a few feet away, holding 2 cups of coffee from a nearby cart. He looked uncertain, as if he wasn't sure whether to approach or retreat. He said he'd noticed her sitting alone and thought she might need something warm. She almost said no, out of habit, but the word stuck. Instead, she took the cup, surprised by how badly her hands were shaking. They sat in silence for a moment. He didn't ask questions right away. He talked about the absurdity of wedding traffic, about how the city always chose the worst times to be beautiful. His voice was calm, grounded. When he finally asked if she was okay, it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like an invitation. The story spilled out in fragments. She didn't give details, just enough for the shape of it to be understood. Newly married. Asked for a divorce. The words sounded unreal even as she said them. He listened without interrupting, without offering solutions that didn't exist. When she finished, he nodded once, like he was acknowledging a truth that deserved respect. They exchanged names. He was in town for work, something involving restoring old buildings, he said. She told him what little she could manage. They talked until the coffee was gone and the night grew quieter. At some point, she realized she was breathing more easily. The ache was still there, but it had softened, like a bruise that no longer screamed at the lightest touch. When they stood to leave, she expected that to be the end of it, a strange kindness from a stranger she'd never see again. But he asked if she wanted to walk a little, just around the block. She surprised herself by saying yes. The next few days passed in a haze of explanations and logistics. The wedding photos were quietly archived. The guests were told there had been a misunderstanding, a mutual decision, a need for privacy. She moved back into her small apartment, boxes stacked like punctuation marks she hadn't yet learned to read. She kept thinking about the man with the coffee. Not in a dramatic way, but like a steady note that returned whenever the silence grew too loud. She told herself it meant nothing. Kindness often arrived without intention. Still, when her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number a week later, her heart skipped. He asked how she was doing. He said he'd thought of her and hoped she was okay. They met for lunch, then again for a walk, then again for no particular reason at all. There was no rush, no expectation. He never treated her like someone broken, never handled her with the exaggerated care that made her feel fragile. He let her talk when she needed to and let the silence be enough when she didn't. Slowly, she found herself laughing again. Not the polite laughter she used to get through awkward moments, but the kind that surprised her, that came from somewhere deep and unguarded. She noticed the way he paid attention to small things, how he remembered her coffee order, how he paused to admire details others overlooked. One afternoon, they sat on a bench watching people pass. She confessed her fear that her life had already taken a wrong turn she couldn't undo. He listened, then said something simple. He said that sometimes the wrong turn was just a road that hadn't revealed its purpose yet. He said survival didn't always look heroic. Sometimes it looked like staying. The divorce moved forward quietly. Papers were signed. A chapter closed without ceremony. She thought it would feel heavier, but instead there was a strange sense of relief, like exhaling after holding her breath too long. Months passed. The city changed colors. Her routines settled into something that felt like her own. The man who had once been a stranger became someone she trusted, someone whose presence felt like home rather than a performance. They talked about their pasts, their fears, the versions of themselves they were still trying to become. One evening, she realized she was falling in love. The realization didn't come with fireworks or panic. It arrived gently, like a truth that had been waiting for permission. She didn't say it right away. She wanted to be sure it was real, not just a response to pain. When she finally told him, it was on a quiet night, sitting on the floor of her apartment, eating takeout from cartons. He didn't hesitate. He said he felt it too, that he had been careful, respectful of her healing, but that his feelings had grown in their own time. There was no rush to define everything. Just an agreement to move forward honestly. She sometimes thought about that wedding day, about how close she had come to believing her story ended before it had truly begun. She thought about the courage it took to sit on those steps and accept a cup of coffee from a stranger. She understood now that endings didn't always announce themselves with finality. Sometimes they cleared space. On the anniversary of the day her life had cracked open, she returned to the same street. The building looked the same. The steps were still there. She stood for a moment, remembering the girl she had been, the fear, the shock, the quiet bravery of staying present. Then she walked on, toward a future she hadn't planned but had chosen, step by steady step.